First, thanks a lot to the zetkin.forum, which is the European partner of Tricontinental. My colleague Atul is sitting here from India in the front. We urge anybody interested in getting involved in the Zetkin Forum or in Tricontinental, people like Maurizio over there who translates our newsletter every week into Italian for Potero al Popolo. If you're interested in getting involved, get involved, because this, comrades, is the battle of ideas. We've got to get out there. Yeah, it's here, but it's also out there. And we have to learn to broaden the culture that we live in. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, okay? So Atul is over here, and the Zetkin people, you already know, they're all over the room. It is the battle of ideas. We're in the middle of it. I think I'm just going to pretend I understand half an hour. Yeah, okay. Yes, okay, thanks. I'm really glad that all of us are building a story. I don't think this is one of those conferences where, we have a different thesis which we need to fight out. Because I think, following the Chinese, proverb, we are feeling the stones to cross the river. Even though fascism has been around for 100 years, it, like many other social processes, is not identical every time it makes an appearance. It's not like it's from a textbook. You ascertain fascism of 1933 and then it appears again. Nothing happens like that. History is very complicated. The contingent factors, or what Jürgen talked about, the mediations, are so important to specify, to look at. And really, when we theorize out of the empirical, we have to experiment with Marxism, because, one of the nice things about Marxism, in my opinion, is that you make the map as you go along. Every Marxist is a Marxist. We don't apply Marx. We learn from the tradition in order to become a Marxist ourselves and understand what the river looks like as we touch the stones. So I really welcome people into this dialogue, because I think from Utsa, Clara to Jürgen, a narrative is shaping, and I hope that the narrative will help us have many conversations in the next few days. I want to start by saying that one of the great curiosities of the rise of reactionary regimes, far-right regimes, neo-fascists, they're not all the same. There's a temptation to say that Erdogan in Turkey is identical to Trump and so on. They're very different in orientation. And you sort of slide as a Marxist between empiricism and theory. Looking at something in its concrete instance with all its historical baggage attached to it, and then trying to create an abstraction that links these different instantiations together. Are they all the same? Is Orban the same phenomena as Millet? What do we do with Keir Starmer? How do we understand the British Labour Party, and so on? I want to start with a proposition, which is that in our time, there is what I think of as an intimate and fatal embrace between liberalism and the far right. There is an intimate and fatal embrace between these two social processes. It's important to understand that liberalism has already hollowed out its own articulation of rights. In the previous era, in the high point of neoliberalism, privatization, commodification, mass austerity, income deflation, and so on, it's not that in that period, these same governments, which had a predisposition to speak about human rights and freedom and so on, it's not as if they didn't put in place an entire architecture to curtail rights. For instance, in the last 25 years, in Europe and in North America, let's call this the Atlantic world for short, in this Atlantic world, anti-terror legislation effectively created what for some people was experienced as a fascist state. In other words, if you were a Muslim, or you looked like a Muslim, or you had some sort of Muslim, or you were black and therefore mistaken as a Muslim, it was pretty rough in the last 25 years, traversing through the Atlantic world. You experience this in your neighborhoods, whether it's what's it called, Molenbeek in Belgium, in Brussels, and so on. These were garrisoned communities. The black community in the United States, the largest mass protest in modern history was the Black Lives Matter protest. Garrisoned communities where these communities were treated as a surplus population, unemployable in a neoliberal monopoly context. Literally a surplus or useless population had to be garrisoned. You know, on the one side you have the gated community where the rich gate themselves in, and on the other side you have these mass prisons that develop in our cities, and indeed not only in cities but in rural areas as well. You have garrisoning of entire populations. Liberalism, in fact, hollowed itself from within, and liberal bureaucrats became pretty used to authoritarian forms of government. I mean, just consider that in Italy, before Meloni comes to power, oh my God, the far right is coming in. You had a prime minister imposed as a technocrat without any democratic process, as if that was democracy. He was imposed on the country. In France, the left bloc wins the largest proportion in the parliament, and Macron imposes a minority prime minister on the population. This is hollowing out the structure. In that sense, there is an intimate relationship between this far right of a special type, which is how we call it in our institute. I agree, names are silly, but we are trying to find a way to see what the river looks like. This far right and liberalism, the first proposition is that they have this intimate relationship, but it's not just intimate, it's also fatal. Let me explain the fatality a little bit. You see, in our time, this form of the far right arises because of what my dear friend Ejaz Ahmed used to call cultures of cruelty. In our societies, cultures of cruelty have become completely normal. You know, from violence against women in the home on the one side, violence against a young black man walking down the street, violence against Muslims in India or Dalits in India, violence against people just completely made normal. You know, the behavior of violence normal in society. Police grab somebody, throws them in the car, people just watch it, film it, don't do anything. A culture of cruelty has set in as a consequence to some extent of the social impact of an austerity society. People are so market dependent. You're afraid to get involved, to exercise your rights, you know, to say, why are you arresting this person? The police turns around to you and says, it's none of your business. If you interfere, we'll arrest you. In other words, your rights will be annulled for trying to evoke the Constitution. This creates a generalized culture of cruelty in society. And this is not imposed by the far right. It wasn't the AFD that sent in, you know, the stormtroopers to break up the Palestine conference in Germany. It was a liberal government that did that. It was a liberal government that said that Yanis Varoufakis is not permitted to even zoom into Germany. It wasn't the AFD that did that. You know, you always have the bugbear of this terrifying, you know, right that's sitting there, but meanwhile, there's this intimate and fatal relationship between these political forces that creates a society which is basically welcoming to the far right of a special kind, neo-fascism, whatever it is. They are welcomed to power by this development in society. So that's the first proposition I want to put before you. And in this proposition, I want to add in one other aspect. In this proposition about the cultures of cruelty, is that increasingly, as a consequence of the nature of monopoly capital in a very competitive, weird situation, because there are large monopoly firms, but they are also territorially bounded. So, for instance, with the arrival of large Chinese firms Apple, which is still a monopoly in its own territorial domain, was contested by Chinese firms and turned to the state for assistance to block Huawei from entering, say, European markets or US markets and so on. They went to the state to actually impose a market regulation against the entry of other monopolies. In this context, there is a savaging of our own societies. Our own societies are being savaged. In other words, there is a way in which, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute, the culture of society has become something like a place where people are effectively so market dependent that they're unable to build communities. Firstly, working lives are so long for most people, commutes are so long. I traveled a few years ago with some women from an area just outside a big city in India. They leave at 3 in the morning, walk to the place where the train comes, sleep on the train, go and stand in a market waiting to be hired as day laborers in somebody's field. Then they come back. By the time they come home, it's night. All they do is wash clothes, prepare the food for the next day, sleep for a few hours. That's their life. It's entirely market dependent and patriarchy dependent. That's their whole existence. Where is the space in this kind of cruel, savage life to exercise liberal rights? Liberalism is become an utter abstraction for billions of people around the world. To consider the existence, the actuality of liberalism in the world is absurd. Most people live in a world which is deeply authoritarian already. Because what is authoritarian for them is not the state, it's the market. It is the market that has become authoritarian. They are seeking jobs, commuting forever to get to, as in this case, to get to a place where they may or may not be hired that day. Utterly dependent on capital for their survival. Utterly dependent. There is no contract work. There are no labor laws. There are no rights. Nothing like that. I mean, how these cities in the advanced countries, in the Atlantic world, how these cities have become suddenly populated with delivery people. Most of them migrants going for hours on bicycles, scooters, etc. to deliver things to people who, are now comfortable not going to shop even. It's a crazy world we live in. Savaged lives. It's impossible to think about liberalism in this world, in a kind of actuality. It doesn't exist. People simply just don't have the leisure, to exercise rights, because rights have to have a social content. It's not just a political abstraction. That society is no longer there. The second proposition I want to place to you is that the neoliberal technocrats, effectively, because they have pushed austerity so hard, have effectively made themselves politically redundant. It's very difficult for neoliberal technocrats to go before the people and make the argument, 5 more years of austerity, then we'll see growth. It's very difficult for them to make that argument. In India, for instance, the neoliberal technocratic party, the Congress party, they don't have an agenda to run on because they are still gripped by the idea that they can manage something called liberal capitalism, which no longer exists. And so they have basically put themselves out of political business unless they create all kinds of alliances and maintain power by blocking either the far right, which is the situation you see in Germany, or in Belgium. I was there when they created a coalition called Arizona. Very interesting. I didn't even know the colors of the Arizona flag, but apparently people in Belgium knew it so well that when these 3 parties joined, they said, well, that's the flag of Arizona. I don't know the flags of the United States, but that was quite, they are very intelligent people there. After all, the manifesto was written in Belgium, so there must be something in the soil. But the far right comes in a very different attitude. It has a kind of testosterone-laden attitude. They make a claim of discipline on society. And it's very interesting, in all our conversation about the far right in the Atlantic world, one element of it doesn't come out often enough, which is that these societies are gripped by fear that they are losing out to the fact that the center of gravity of the world economy has moved to Asia. They are gripped by fear. They are gripped by fear that China is going to outproduce them. China will produce better trains, it will produce better consumer products and so on. And there's a way, I'm putting this forward as an idea, there's a way I feel that these politicians come in, they have this sensibility that they will come in tough and they'll do a couple of things. And we saw that in Trump's second administration. He sort of lined up a bunch of rich guys, the oligarchic types, including the head of the SoftBank from Japan. It lines them up and says he's going to invest, $1 billion in the US economy. He's going to invest. It was a little bit like Mohammed bin Salman when he took all the rich Saudis, put them in the hotel and told them, give me your money, give me your money, give me your money. They are telling the audience, which is the constituency, it's a game show in a sense, telling the audience that I'm going to grab wealth, I'm going to grab it, I'm going to squeeze its throat, and it's going to cough out jobs for you. And I'm going to discipline you so that you work as hard as the Chinese workers because we have to stop their advance. One part of the rise of the far right in the Atlantic world is this kind of sinking feeling that something is being lost and China has to be defeated. The new Cold War against China is very much part of the context of the rise, in my opinion, of this far right. The third point, I want to dwell for just a few minutes on what we might consider classical fascism. It's very clear, and everybody has said it one way or the other, that classical fascism appears in the late 20s into the 30s as a fear of the rise of Bolshevism. After the October Revolution, and then the strikes in northern Italy, the rise and strength of the German working class, and so on. There's a sense that restive workers in the Ruhr Valley and agricultural workers in the Po Valley in Italy have to be smashed. There's a sense of fear of the spread of Bolshevism. And Clara Zetkin wrote something in August 1923, which I found very instructive. She said, fascism is the punishment of the proletariat for failing to carry on the revolution begun in Russia. In other words, having failed to carry on the revolution, having failed to do the domino theory that the Americans were afraid of in Vietnam. Imagine, October Revolution happens, then there's a revolution in Poland, there's a revolution in Germany, a revolution in Austria. It would have been a different world. I often think I'd like to write a novel which is about that. What would it be like to have had the Scottish, is it Belfast? The Belfast Soviet and the Soviet in Limerick, because these were actual events in history. There was a Soviet in Glasgow. There was a Soviet in Glasgow. There was a Soviet in Limerick. Imagine if that had happened. Zetkin says the failure to conduct the revolution, the punishment was fascism. And that's a very instructive phrase. It's true. Point one, that in a sense, classical fascism is a counter-revolutionary, reactionary movement to smash the workers' movement. That has been known to us since the Comintern writings of the 20. It's interesting, people criticize the Comintern for the 1928 line. But in fact, if you read all the materials, and I'm not asking you to do it because there's a lot of material, it's all now available. Their attempt to understand fascism is really interesting because they're also struggling to put their finger in whether this is a military dictatorship or a mass movement or how to characterize the different classes and so on. It's very instructive to read their material. And I, when you gave me the task, I went and read some of it, not all of it, I'll say that. I mean, Zetkin, for instance, was thinking between fascism being what she called a military terrorist movement and a mass movement with deep social roots. It's interesting what this other Clara was saying earlier today, because when she was, and even Utsa, when they were talking about, especially Utsa, when she was talking about how small capital finds itself losing its economic power and then having no political power, even in the local area. These classes, petty proprietors, of one kind or the other, small farmers and so on, there is no real easy political constituency for them, even in the 1920s and 30s. And it's interesting, in India, about, I think, 500,000 farmers committed suicide in about 25 years after they liberalized the country in 1991. 500,000 farmers committed suicide. That futility in that period could have become a mass base for both a right-wing and a left-wing movement. There was some, indeterminacy in where this class of workers could have gone. That indeterminacy is very important. In a lot of the Comintern writing, there's some rigidities come in. Like they say, the petty bourgeois is the natural ally of the fascists. I'm not sure if these rigidities are so true across time. I think this is something that is very, very contingent, and it depends on a million factors. I don't think you can go into this with a formula. It really depends on how people's class relations are operating. It's not just their class position, but their class relations. Because right after the peak of the farmers' suicide in India, there was a massive farmers' movement where millions of farmers were mobilized and blocked 2 bills, which the right were pushing to Uberize Indian farming. Millions of farmers for a year sat around Delhi. This is the same class, to some extent, that had been committing suicide in an earlier era. There's a lot of contingency in the class analysis, in my opinion. It is also true that under classical fascism, I don't know if any of you really read Togliatti, but Palmiro Togliatti was a very close observer of fascism, both in Italy and Germany, because he spent a lot of time in Moscow meeting communists from other parts of the world, engaging with Dimitrov and so on. He suggested that it's an error to look at all reactionary bourgeois sections as fascists, that there were different kinds of reactionary bourgeois. And I think Utsa's statement about Japan is interesting. It's a question to ask, was Japanese militarism fascist? Is it all the same? Is there something distinct about Japanese militarism when they went to mass military spending and going out and capturing parts of East Asia? Was that the same as Lebensraum? Because in fact they didn't people those areas with the Japanese population. They subjugated the population and took raw materials, and so it was the rifle more than the spade that was important. They were not going there as settlers. They were actually just taking the raw materials and so on. And the last point on classical fascism is precisely what Utsa was talking about. If you read Mein Kampf, and I'm not sure you do, but in Mein Kampf, there is a really interesting section where Hitler talks about the United States, where he says the surplus population from Europe, from Britain, from Italy, and so on, went to the United States, massacred the Native Americans. That was Lebensraum. We want to do the same with the Slavs. We want to go and take the land. We want to have our own empire. In fact, it's interesting. We don't, when we think about fascism, yoke it to the category of late imperialism. Because both Italy in Ethiopia and in other parts of Africa and Germany in the East was seeking a kind of late empire. They come in late to the imperial game. They want to export their population. They want to agglomerate land. Hitler says it directly. He calls it Lebensraum, living space. That's exactly what the British did, the Italians did in the United States. That section of the book is chilling to read because he's basically saying, I'm taking my lessons from US history. You did it, now why can't we do it? If the Anglo-Saxons and the Southern Europeans can do it, why can't the Germans do it to the East and take the East? Imperialism is part of classical fascism. It's not something extraneous to it. It's very much part of it. The fourth point I want to make is the one that I started making earlier about the far right of a special type that we see today. It's interesting. In the earlier period, there was a worry about a surplus population of people like oneself. So in Germany, the Aryans who needed living space. Now the anxiety is different. It's that the right kind of people are not having enough children. So that there are too many immigrants coming into these societies, having the wrong kind of children. And the right kind of people, in other words, white people, are not having enough children. And the far right has these conferences which don't get reported much, but which are called pro-natalist conferences, where they talk about the fact that they are anti-abortion for white women and pro-natalist for white women. So Elon Musk, for instance, has, I think, 15 or 16 children and counting. No idea how many children he has. They are pro-natalists of the right kind. They don't want the wrong kind of people in their living space. They only want the right kind. See, it's a difference. Now there's a diminishing population, not a surplus population to go out there and keep, but a diminishing population. So the one side, there is this, pro-natalist, very patriarchal kind of policy inside the far right. That's important, I think, to attend to very closely, watch what they are saying, and also their population dynamics different than in the earlier era. But secondly, rather than appear as a spear against a rising class-conscious tide within their own societies, which was the case in the 20s and 30s, the far right is actually emerging to confront another problem, which is, as I said earlier, the problem of the rise of Asia, and particularly China. That is the enemy of the far right, far more, in my opinion, than any domestic threat to them. In a sense, they want to tighten the reins in these countries, bring back policies that they implemented abroad, like labor market reform and so on, intensify exploitation within their own societies. In the United States, they tried this with semiconductor chips. They brought a factory from Taiwan to Arizona. And the Taiwanese engineers said, we can't work here. People just don't want to work. They don't have the work ethic. We can't do it. And they just went home. And that's a lesson not to the liberals and so on, because Biden just kept talking about we need to increase investment. That's a lesson that the far right takes. You got to discipline the workforce, your own workforce. In other words, this is not for immigrant workers. You don't want immigrant workers to be brought in. They are the wrong kind of people. Earlier Trump's advisor, Steve Bannon, went on a show before Trump won the presidency the first time and just ranted about Indians. There were too many Indian mathematicians and engineers in the United States. He said, we have to stop bringing them in, because bringing them in stops us from training our own kind in engineering and mathematics. A very interesting statement he made in this podcast, I think in 2015. Very interesting and very much along the grain of their thought processes, which is the far right of a special kind wants to create relatively homogeneous societies where, quote unquote, their women are having more children, their children are studying mathematics and engineering, and their society is able to triumph against the Chinese threat. It's very much part of their viewpoint. So the first thing about the far right of a special kind, just to list the 7 things. The first thing is that they, of course, demonize migrants and people who are not white and so on. Just what Utsa was saying, they find some way to, in a sense, displace the conversation from unemployment, income suppression, etc., to demonization. In a way, we should also recognize that hate is a lot easier to utilize through the mass media than reason. Reason is really difficult to utilize in like TikTok and Instagram and so on. It's really hard to have a conversation on social media. The form of social media is much more given to hate or strong emotions like hate than it is to reason. I mean, to have a discussion, for instance, about October 7th, what happened on October 7th, and the status of Hamas is impossible. I mean, you just cannot have a discussion on social media about that, because you need more space to have a conversation about, what is the Palestinian reality, what happened in the 1930s, what happened in by the time you do all that in social media, somebody's watching a cooking show. They're gone. But if you just say Hamas is a terrorist organization, that's it. That spreads like crazy. I mean, the content is really, the form is really suited to demonization and hate. Very hard for reason to triumph in the form of media that they've established. The second point, as I've said, is this idea of being terrified about the loss of economic buoyancy, particularly to China, but in fact to parts of Asia. The third point about the far right is that it doesn't rupture its links to neoliberalism. It doesn't rupture its links. In fact, it's trying to deepen it. It's trying to harden society, to discipline workers and so on. To go after all this stuff they call woke culture, stop people from focusing on diversity, concentrate on mathematics, concentrate on becoming an engineer. Yeah, don't think about the historical context, and don't waste your time on all that stuff. We don't need to discuss feelings. We need to discuss what you're going to do to get a better deal against the Chinese. That's more important than your feelings. Then the idea that this kind of far right is, in fact, the claim that it's anti-state is completely misleading. There is no bourgeois entity that is actually libertarian to the point of anti-state. They are libertarian when it comes to social care, but they are completely wedded to the state when it comes to repression and war. Internal repression, all libertarians are in favor of it. I mean, Elon Musk was a big libertarian, bought Twitter and started just junking people he didn't like from Twitter personally, sending messages personally himself, saying block that person, throw them out, and so on. They are libertarians when it comes to their class interests. Libertarianism is a very class-specific ideology. It's not a generalizable principle. And finally, on the point of the far right, they just will never make a break from imperialism. It is impossible. Whatever they may say, we don't like this, we don't like Maloney, I'm not keen on NATO, then they go right into NATO. They don't have a problem. Their problem is different. Their problem is not imperialism as such. They would like to use force to make, say, China surrender through a currency revaluation. They would like to use force to do that. But they are quite content also just to keep their military there, threaten other countries, make sure they don't try to seek sovereignty, and meanwhile strengthen their own world. I mean, they have an imperialist mindset in the name of not intervening. Trump is interesting. He didn't immediately intervene against Iran. He said, I'll take 2 weeks to think about it, which is a very long period of time in a fourth-generation war. 2 weeks is like years in a fourth-generation war. They are both non-interventionist, but they want to use the fist of violence to threaten countries, to make sure that they don't overcome the United States in its desire for what it called years ago, its desire for preponderant power. I had to look that word up. It was in a State Department document. It comes from God, preponderant power. That's what the United States seeks, says the US State Department. I want to just end with a little reflection on culture, because it's important for us to understand that the fight we're in is not just a political fight. This is not just a fight against these forces of the far right, this political bloc, the AFD or this or that. We are fighting to defend a culture. This culture is completely eroded. I mean, Trump is not Hitler. He's like a replica. He's like a broken mirror figure. I mean, he's perfect because he's the guy who was the host of The Celebrity Apprentice, where his tagline was, "You're fired." I mean, he's the perfect instantiation of the far right in this period and of the culture in this period. I mean, look at these European societies that are so unable to offer even I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the elite classes in these societies, unable to offer up any philosopher capable of providing a moral argument about anything. I mean, I've been asking people, where are the Jean-Paul Sartres in Europe today, and the Bertrand Russells and people like that. Even the Nazis seem to have had better philosophers than the far right today. People like Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger, whatever you think of them, even they had better philosophers than who are the far right's philosophers today? I mean, are they interesting? They are media creations. They are pathetic. The culture is a dead and decadent culture. In fact, I would say that I marvel at Europe. I marvel. how is Europe so quickly allowed its cultural inheritance to vanish? Where is the culture? Where is the moral fiber to say that we are, for instance, against the genocide of the Palestinians? Where is that moral voice, that clarity of the Paris Commune going backwards? Where has that gone? It seems to have vanished from the culture. You're fighting not just against a political force. Anti-fascism or anti-far right or whatever you want to call it, it's not just a political fight to elect some bourgeois, to have an alliance with the SPD to make sure that the far right stays out. You're fighting to defend your culture because your culture has become decadent. And that's a real fight, a deep fight, a serious fight. And for that fight, it's not just a political fight, it's a fight in the realm of the battle of ideas. So don't forget to get involved with the Zetkin Forum. Thanks.